Thank you all very much for coming. This is a program that's been in gestation for several weeks in connection with the FIFA program at Foxborough, aka Boston Stadium. If I go to my next high school reunion, which is in question, and they have any kind of like kind of what's your line quiz about what you've been doing the last 10 years, there we go. And someone says, who's the individual that hosted a talk program about soccer? And if I put up my hands, people will just laugh because it's an impossibility. I've never been associated with anything involving sports in my whole life. So this has been a lot of quick learning on my part. I haven't really learned that much, but a whole lot more than I knew a few weeks ago. Again, we were looking for a way to bring the museum into the line with FIFA, and I did just quick Google of soccer history in Massachusetts, and I was amazed to discover that there is a lot of soccer history in Massachusetts, a tremendous amount, in fact, and some of it goes back, as we'll be hearing later, to the 1860s. My search led me to this book, Inventing the Boston Game, and its co-author, Kevin Talek Marston, and the rest is history. I contacted Kevin, and he got on board with having a program right away, and then we went from there. So let me do a quick introduction. I'm Alan Earls, chair of the Historical Commission. Rich Frangillo is to my immediate left. He's a former superstar of Franklin soccer, I think, I can say without too much exaggeration. Longtime youth soccer coach. To his left is Christine Moore, who's the chair of the Plainville Historical Commission and runs the Great Plainville Museum, and also for 14 years has been employed at the Patriots Hall of Fame and is also a big sports history fan. And last but not least, as I mentioned, Kevin Talek Marston, who is an academic based in Switzerland. I can tell by his accent that he probably didn't grow up in Switzerland, but maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that. And he joins us as an author and as an academic, and the rest is history. Maybe you guys can just do a little more of an introduction of yourselves, and then we can get into some questions and tackle the topic.
Well, you said that your high school compatriots would be surprised. What I get is, oh, hey, this soccer thing's starting to catch on around here, isn't it? But I've been involved for 50 plus years, which is crazy on its own. So I grew up in Franklin. I played in Franklin and went on to play and be involved in different things and in the state and the town. I've been a director here in Franklin for quite a number of years. So it's near and dear to my heart. And I have a history interest as well. Put together a website for the Franklin High School boys that people can check out online. But happy to be here.
As Alan said, I'm from Plainville. I work over at the Hall of Fame for the Patriots. I played soccer as a kid for Plainville Youth Soccer, and remember the World Cup being here in '94, and it was a big thing then. Soccer, believe it or not, does have a lot to do with football and football's history, so I'm excited to be here for that and talk about what I know about football's history and its connection to soccer.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Alan. It's a pleasure to have thought about this and conceived this, I guess, kind of jointly. It was really fun. So just a word about myself. From the accent, yes, you're right. I did not grow up in Switzerland. I have been living over there for 20-some years. But I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. My mother is French, my father's from the U.S., and so we grew up in a very bilingual household. And my sport connections go largely before that, because my mother actually is a football or soccer pioneer from France. She played back in the 60s when in France it was not very common for women to play the game, but she was absolutely crazy about soccer and started a first team and ended up when I was born over here in the States, but she was actually my first soccer coach. So because she knew more about the game than some of the fathers who were around, and so she was there and say, well, no, actually probably ought to try this or do that, and so it was quite fun. And so I've been over in Europe doing work with the International Center for Sports Studies, which is FIFA's academic arm, so we're essentially a research and teaching institution, and I've been working there for 20 plus years and also very closely involved with the Society for American Soccer History, currently serving as its president for the last 2 years, which is an exciting time to be involved with the World Cup here today. So I'll pass it back to you, Alan.
Fabulous. Well, hey, why don't we start chronologically and just talk about the 19th century roots, which you touch on in the book you co-wrote. It's kind of an amazing story that's, I guess, got little elements of controversy in it, but also a really great story. There's lots in there that's worth hearing about. Like, what were the origin stories and who played what where and how did it evolve into more of a widespread phenomena? Maybe Christine and Kevin can tackle that.
You go first.
Okay. Well, I popped this up on the screen just for this way. Our panel can see it too. So, who invented football? I think Christine and I will have a really interesting discussion on this. But what do we really mean by football first? Do we mean that ball that is changing, that is something different? And I think that's where it will be really interesting to discuss what we mean by football, because football and soccer. And all football sports, so rugby, Gaelic football, Australian rules, Canadian, they all come from the same kind of origins in the middle of the 19th century. And you have a mixing of collective games with people who are a lot of the times young boys playing in schools or in towns and villages. And that is a sport that is codified and structured and regulated more and more over the course of the 19th century. But they all have the same origin. That's why often until the end of the 19th century, football is always spelled in two words: football. So it's a sport that is generally played with the feet. And at the time, because of the way technology works, most of the balls that are produced then are not the shape of an American football that you see here, because we don't have the technology to produce that yet. So we're not mass producing balls at this point. They're hand producing and they're inflating them with a pig's bladder and that sort of thing. And it's only in the middle of the 19th century where you actually start to produce real equipment that you can play with. And that's where it starts to get interesting and messy. And so one of the images that's on the back there is that round ball that currently sits in a museum in Boston. So at Otis House, it used to be at Otis House. It's no longer at Otis House. But it's historic New England, and they have one of the world's oldest still existing footballs. Well, soccer balls, or, footballs. I think maybe that's where... Well, I'll just stop with the next image, and then I'll pass it to Christine, because this is we're here for a soccer heritage panel. Now have a look at that image above, right? That's a monument to the Oneida Football Club, right? If you look carefully at the top of that monument, what's on the top of that monument? That's an American football. Now, the funny story about that, and we'll come back to it later, is that monument, which is on Boston Common, probably, how many of you have walked across Boston Common? Everybody, right? Have you ever noticed it? No, of course not, because it's one of the most nondescript monuments, has no markers. It's not really in any of the tourism guides and that sort of thing. You just walk past. It's next to Spruce Street at the entrance to the top. It's actually right next to the Founders Memorial, the big Founders Memorial on Boston Common. That monument has been changed twice in the last 100 years. It has featured an American football, a soccer ball, and now currently features again an American football. But we'll come back to that.
So at the Patriots Hall of Fame, we have an exhibit that's dedicated to the history of the sport. And one thing we always tell the kids, because they don't realize it and they get really excited about it, is because football has its origins here in New England, more specifically Massachusetts. A lot of people think because Canton, Ohio has the Football Hall of Fame, that's automatically where football developed. And no, it's our sport. It's from New England. It's our sport. We have a ball on display from 1876. It's not as square as that one. It's more rounded. But the Football Hall of Fame has documented it, and they believe it's definitely up there in age. I don't believe it's the oldest. I believe that one is. But it's definitely up there in age. And it just shows how the ball itself evolved for at least American football from that round, or in this case square, like soccer rugby thing, into a ball they start throwing in 1906 to make the game safer, to spread it out. The forward pass came into the game later because of just how much danger the game created. Players were getting hurt, killed playing the game. There were stories of players hiding things on their person to hurt their opponent, like brass knuckles, knives, because there were no rules. And it reached the point where Theodore Roosevelt stepped in and he gave the schools, all the colleges, an ultimatum. Either clean up the game, make it safer for your players, or I'm going to abolish the game of football as we know it today. And the colleges all got together, had a massive conference, started changing some of the rules to make the game safer. And one of the rules that was proposed by Walter Camp, who's considered the father of American football, was to spread the field out a little bit, widen the fields, make it a little bit easier to spread the players out. And the only problem they found with that was Harvard had built the first permanent stadium in 1903. They couldn't widen their field. So that was how the forward pass came into the game. And from what I understand from research, Walter Camp hated the idea of the forward pass, and he actually fought it, tried to get it eradicated from the game for the rest of his life. But we have another ball that's from 1909 that shows that quick evolution from that round rugby soccer thing to something that you could start throwing. I got little hands. I can't imagine even holding that thing, but it's starting to look like a football.
Maybe I'll just pick up on that really quickly to come back to the museum, because this is all really tied. Thank you so much, Christine. So this was the monument back in 1925. And this is what it looks like over time. So that's a soccer ball, 1970s and 80s, in the 1990s. And then it comes back. So this is so basically we have this progression from a very old round ball to a gridiron football in the 1920s. And then it comes to a soccer ball after the 1994 World Cup. And then we have return to an image of an American football. But what we're saying here is essentially is the origins of this is all tied together. And maybe I'll just plow through that. There we go. In many respects, a lot of the story behind our sports history is all about how we write a national founding story, a national narrative. And if you think about Boston, what is Boston known for? And New England is known for having founded everything in the United States, right? Pretty much. But that is a construction, okay? From the 1920s, there's a huge preservationist movement, an antiquarian movement that founds all of the societies and museums that you go and see in Boston. Those are largely a creation of the late 19th century, from the 1880s, 90s, and up until the 1920s, when the United States is in the midst of a massive immigration movement. Oh, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Interesting. It's interesting. In the 1920s, you have about the same immigration percentages, total population, as we have today. It's the first time it's happened in 100-some years. And so as a reaction to that, in many respects, the world of Boston Brahmin, you're all probably familiar with the term, they want to preserve their history. So what do? They create institutions. They donate their material. Very different from some of the stuff we'll talk about later. They donate this ball, they donate this book, and that allows you to write a history about the past, okay? And all of that comes to 1922, where they donate their ball to a museum. Now, this is a wonderful picture. It's from the Boston. It used to be the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. Today, Historic New England. But as you know, they're playing with a round ball. Christine just told us that they're playing this kind of messy game that is not American football. It's not soccer either. So what are they doing? Well, in 1925, the game that is on everybody's radar from a football perspective is American college football, right? It's the one that fills the stadium in Harvard that we can't expand because there's a problem with it. It fills the Yale Bowl, where Walter Camp comes from. It's not the stadium that's behind us on that screen. We'll come back to that in a moment. Which is Mark Stadium down in Tiverton, which doesn't exist anymore. Harvard Stadium still does. Yale Bowl does, but Tiverton doesn't. They donate that because they say, the big important game, the one played by the colleges, the amateur gentlemen, right? That's American football. So they deliberately say, well, we're going to associate our monument with a American football, even though our round ball is sitting in a museum. We'll come back to that.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll have to come back and explain why those young gentlemen call themselves the Oneida or Oneida Football Club, which is very strange to me because I always think New York when I think Oneida. But more importantly, where do we go from that to like teens and 20s and something that looks like modern soccer? I don't know if that's something you want to tackle or.
So, read the headline with me. Nearly 15,000 fans taxed the capacity of the stadium. Yesterday's soccer classic, which made history at Mark Stadium. So this is a stadium for the American Soccer League. Never heard of that, maybe? In the 1920s, which was so important, okay, that it almost got the United States Soccer Federation kicked out of FIFA in 1927. Okay, because the European federations were so angry that the players were being poached and coming to play in the United States in the 1920s, because they were, remember, this is a working class professional sport, but they were getting jobs and getting pay over here, playing at that stadium that's up on the screen, and elsewhere in New York. They were playing at Ebbets Field later. They played all across different places. The 1920s is the roaring period for soccer in the United States. But it's a very different game than the one that's being played, the American football, that's being played in the college stadiums on college campuses. So it's two completely different worlds. So you can put this in context, right? Here we have, this is the Fall River newspaper from 1923. So we have a huge full-page article all about the game. We have multiple pictures. We also have on the side here, interesting, Yale's result from the exact same weekend, okay? One day before, 80,000 people went to the game. So we have 15,000, biggest soccer crowd, and we have 80,000 for Yale. So it shows the context also of what's going on at this period. Harvard, they don't print the attendance here, but this was about 35 to 40,000 attended the Harvard versus Brown. So we have two completely different worlds. We have kind of working class immigrant focused soccer, and we have very American colleges with their unpaid, supposedly, right? Maybe Christine can talk about that, players. So we have this vibrant scene, but all of that is happening in the 1920s, and then we have in 1925 the Reed-Johnson Act, which for anybody who has some 20th century American history, it's the legislation that closes the door to immigration. It installs quotas and stops the millions of waves of immigrants that have come for the 40 previous years, and it stops from 1925 onwards. And it, in large part, affects the soccer scene because a lot of the people playing here and attending these games are working in the factories and the mills. All of the areas around Franklin, not so far from here, that you know very well, are working class immigrant towns with factories, mills, textile, and all this. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, we have Great Depression. We have a terrible fire in Fall River that destroys 6 or 7 blocks, millions of dollars of damage, affects the team moves and leaves in 1930. And Fall River as a city, in that sense, largely collapses after that, around the Great Depression. So soccer hits this high point and then crashes. So that's our sort of pre-World War II. And then after World War II, we have a completely different picture. Maybe I can pass that, from 60s, 70s, and 80s. Rich, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, well, all those immigrants that brought the game and taught their children to play the game didn't stop loving the game, and they continued to play in neighborhoods and parks and cities and all around, certainly in Massachusetts. And our Franklin story really comes from that, in that an Englishman came to the United States in 1905, and he had a couple of boys. Those boys came to Franklin. Those boys had boys, and they played, and that started our youth program. I did a little bit of research here of the number of active youth players. Now, this is sort of registered youth players. This is not backyard youth players, but still, it gives you a sense. So in 1960, under 10,000, this is nationally, under 10,000. But in 2006, 3.2 million. This year, 3.5 million. And you might well see that go up just a little bit after the World Cup. But it's interesting to me. I was saying to Kevin before that if we look at the biggest competitors in Open Cup competitions in the early 1900s, and where those contributing teams are from, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, Rochester, Minnesota, these are still hotbeds of soccer because they had deep roots in the culture there. So
I'm not sure who would tackle this. I have a couple of questions as a layperson, essentially. To what extent did soccer groups remain ethnically connected? And then more recently, as Kevin mentioned his mother's perspective in France as a woman, young woman player. Did that contribute to the growth of soccer here, and especially Title IX, the federal laws? Did that help drive this resurgent or new sport?
well, I'll pass it down, but I can say anecdotally that from my refereeing experience in adult soccer here in Massachusetts, a lot of still ethnic ties. Cape Verdeans and Irish and Portuguese and Brazilian, and going on down the line, still have teams today, playing. There are 30-year-olds playing, 50-year-olds playing in these leagues.
Thanks for the question, Alan. The question of identity of the game, I think that's an important one, is what is the identity of the sport? What does that, in a sense, what does that mean? If we can unpack that. And that's where it's interesting to think about the history that Boston and New England has. As Christine said, sport, football, soccer has such a strong root in this area of the country. It's not the only place in the country. I mean, I will speak to, I'm not an advocate for one region or another, but there's a national history. But Boston and New England certainly has a very, very strong history in the past, particularly linked to these immigrant communities, which continued over the course of the 20th century. I mean, I'll come to your question there, Alan. After the Second World War, you have a massive growth. I mean, Rich just gave us some interesting statistics about the number of registered players. And what we see is after World War II, particularly into the 60s and 70s, after Vietnam, we have a huge boom of youth soccer associations that are created across the country. Youth soccer associations. Now, people had been playing in a lot of ethnic clubs and associations. You might have, there was also a lot of displaced person involved after, during the early Cold War. So people were playing in Ukrainian American communities, in Lusophone communities, et cetera, et cetera. But as we get into the 70s and 80s, we have a change to that where things become, quote unquote, Americanized. So often we move from ethnic named communities or teams, and people will just start generic teams, the Tigers, right? Just like you would see in other youth sports. And so there's a mixing of that's happening. And I would say even across the 20th century, a lot of the quote-unquote ethnic soccer origins is very mixed anyway. There are people playing across different communities, whether it's German, whether it is Spanish-speaking, et cetera, across the country. It's all very, very mixed, even though it might be called the German-Hungarian League in New York, for example. There's people from a lot of different backgrounds that are playing. But as we get through to the 70s, we have a huge soccer boom, as Rich was talking about. And this is perhaps to touch on the women's question. One of the biggest changes in 1972 is we have Title IX, which is a legislation that is not at all designed to discuss sport. It was purely for higher education and funding for women and men. That was the purpose. It just had an incredible impact on athletics, and in this sense, one of the easiest sports to fund at universities and colleges is soccer. Has little equipment. You don't need a lot you don't even have to play indoors with a facility. You can play outside. So one of the easiest team sports to put onto college campuses in order to get the number of parity between men and women in athletics was women's soccer. And you have an explosion in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and it's what leads eventually to the first women's U.S. national women's team in 1985. Which doesn't get the recognition that they should. And the women then go and they win the first Women's World Cup in 1991. That probably happened. Nobody here really remembered it or knew it. But they won the first Women's World Cup for the first official. There were other events before. But the women essentially begin to dominate. And that is something that really affects the national story about soccer in the 1990s. And maybe then we can come to some of the great material that Rich has about 1994 and the World Cup.
Tell me more culturally about what soccer looked like and how it changed people. My perception, again, as an outsider, was that soccer was for people who were a little different. If you were 100% flag waving, drive a big gas guzzling car kind of person, you followed American football or you played American football. But everybody else started to think soccer was a kind of a cool thing to do, and it seemed like it became part of a cultural, much wider cultural shift in the world, and maybe just a part of that. And then more specifically, were this the same set of rules this whole time, or was that evolving a lot too? Maybe you can tackle that.
Well, what I can say is that the barrier to entry for children to play a sport for soccer is very low. And so that's really inviting for people to contribute to a team, even if they don't have a tremendous amount of technical ability or a tremendous amount of athletic ability. The ball can still hit you and go in the general direction of your team, and you can make a contribution. So I think that as it became a little bit more available to watch on TV, and we can talk about TV, but TV had a huge impact here when we only had 3 stations, and we're competing with all the other major sports. There wasn't a place for soccer, but as we go along, and now there's specialty channels where you can watch European League or another national league. Now you've got some excitement about it. Anyway, that makes it available to young children, and then I think a lot of what's happened in the 70s and 80s is that children then bring the adults into the game, and then now it's created this cycle where adults are teaching children and moving us forward in these big numbers. But I think that's still true today. It's very easy to start playing. Yeah.
Maybe just to add on the rules, obviously the rules evolve in all sports. I mean, we see rule changes in so many different sports across time. But the game, as Rich said, is an easy access one, particularly with the construction of simple fields. So in the 1970s and 80s, you have a youth soccer phenomenon across the country, not just here in Massachusetts and New England, but where parents will literally at the time go out to the hardware store, buy things because there isn't perhaps in that park a set of goals, and they will go and build a set of goals. And so it's a grassroots, ground-up movement for places that don't already have the facilities. And that booms across the 70s and 80s because kids can play, and kids can play to a certain age mixed. So we have girls and boys playing, and it becomes everybody's sport. And so the huge change in the 1970s is that soccer becomes a sport where everybody's familiar with it because, yeah, I played it when I was a kid. And that is something that is not necessarily the case across the country before the 1970s. And maybe we have to mention one thing, which is, I know we're not in New York, but we do have to mention New York. Because in 1975, Pele, the greatest, everybody is nodding because you all know, everybody knows Pele. He comes to play in New York, and that is the David Beckham moment of the 1970s. So when he comes, it transforms the perception of the game, because all of a sudden it's, wow, everybody here can play.
And you asked also about the rules. At least in the last 45 years, the rule book has changed a little bit, but not very much. It's evolved to make it better. There's even things we're seeing this week that we haven't seen before, little tweaks in here and there. But by and large, the game's rules haven't changed, at least in that time.
Yeah, and just to pursue the point a little further, it's a sport that values athleticism, but you don't have to be 250 or 300 pounds and muscle bound to play and be successful. Other attributes of athleticism come into play. It's great. What about, how did we get to the 1994 World Cup? That seemed, from what I've read or seen, that was kind of an unexpected thing. What made that happen? Anybody want to tackle that?
I was only 10 years old.
Well, I was a teenager, but maybe a backstory to the 1994 World Cup is that obviously FIFA, who organizes the World Cup, for much of the 20th century, FIFA is designed to spread the game around the world. That's essentially a core mission of the sport, and to have as many federations around the world that can play. Right? There's more member associations of FIFA than there are members of the UN. That's kind of a wonderul claim that FIFA and the Olympic Committee, they like to claim these types of things. But so having a global sport and a global game is very important. And over the course of the 1970s and 80s, there is a new leadership in FIFA at that point and really wants to take the sport outside. Because until the 1994 World Cup, the World Cup only happened in Europe or South America or Mexico, because Mexico is not South America, as many Mexicans will remind you. It is between Europe and South America. It's completely dominated by that axis. Those are the historic places where, you know, all the quote-unquote traditions and everything are. And the FIFA at the time really wanted to take the game beyond. They're very interested in the 1970s to get Asia involved, to get Africa involved, to get North America involved, not just Mexico, because Mexico is already in it. And so what happens over the course of the 1970s and 80s is there is a conscious effort to try and get into the American market, because America at that point is known as having a big, sports. It's the market for sports. And so there's an effort by, on the one hand, the American soccer officials who would love to have the World Cup come to the United States, and they actually tried to get the World Cup in 1986. Okay, so the one that ended up in Mexico in 1986, which should have been in Colombia, which didn't happen in Colombia, ends up in Mexico, but the U.S. had bid for that, and they were close. Henry Kissinger was part of the committee there, and they really, really tried. It didn't happen, but basically FIFA said, okay, but we will come back, don't worry. And so over the course of the 80s, which is a difficult moment because the national league, the NASL at that point, has died. So we had this 1920s glorious period of American soccer. We showed the picture on the 1970s and 80s. Again, big leagues, New York, the Meadowlands filled, 70,000 people watching Pele. The league dies after 1983 and 84. 84 is the last year. And soccer moves indoors and on the amateur fields, largely in that sense. You have semi-professional lacrosse, but it's there. And so one of the missions of FIFA is to say we need to really get into this market again. And so there's a bid, and the U.S. is awarded the 1994 World Cup on July 4th of 1988, if my memory is correct. And that is, we're taking the world's game to America. So that's the kind of sort of backstory. And of course, at that point, you don't have Major League Soccer. You don't have the New England Revolution. Rich is a season ticket holder, am I right? Yes. You don't have the MLS yet. You have college soccer, you have women's soccer, but you don't have the national professional scene yet. And that's one of the conditions, actually, that FIFA gives to the United States and says, if you're going to host the World Cup, you must have a Division I professional league, again, national league. And so there are business interests that come together, corporate interests, and we come to a moment where television is changing, advertising is changing, and all of that. But that's the backstory of how we get to 94. And 94 I know, Rich, you should speak to this because you were involved with, as a volunteer, you were in it. Maybe you should, I'll pass it over to you. Tell me what the experience was.
Yeah, well, it was fantastic because, like Kevin said, the National League had dissolved. And so there was no high-level play to aspire to. So we had college, but that was not an end game for someone who wanted to continue to play. So if you weren't good enough to make it to Europe, you finished your career. And so the excitement to bring the world game to here was tremendous. Created a lot of stir and launched leagues, but not only the men's league, but the women's league. And the youth numbers after 1994 just shot up because now you had heroes you could connect to.
Question for Christine. In that hallowed ground of professional football, you must see people come in wearing soccer jerseys and stuff. There must be a mixed crowd, so to speak. How has that changed, and is it now accepted that it's an and, not an or? People may be very interested in more than one sport.
I think definitely with the Revolution being part of the New England Patriots organization, at least in that same stadium, even though they're getting their own stadium in a couple of years, I think that's really helped. They came in 1996 is when the Revs came in, and I think that really helped boost, at least around here with soccer. I mean, I remember going to my first Revs game with my cousins, and it was actually against the Chicago Fire, and it was at the old Foxborough Stadium. and it was a lot of fun. And both my cousin and I played soccer, so we loved it. We thought it was great seeing these professionals playing in our own backyard. So at the hall, we definitely see an increase, even on Revs games. If the Revs are playing in the afternoon and the hall's still open, depending on the weather, if it's really nice out there outside, but a lot of times people from the Revs will come in and they got kids and adults, they're wearing the Revs jerseys, they're wearing other international teams, and they're just excited to be there. And the school groups that we have come throughout the school year, you see kids wearing Messi jerseys, you see them wearing all the international jerseys, so it's still a big thing with the next generation.
Thank you. Maybe Rich or Kevin or anyone. So we finally get soccer, World Cup soccer here in the North America, the rest of North America, and how does that affect you and the people involved on the ground with soccer? Did that really light a fire, more or less?
Well, I can say in my own experience that I was already into it. So to me, it felt like a natural progression. But what Christine is saying was typical true in the media. You know, it used to be you'd tune into Channel 5 News and they'd be covering the Red Sox and Bruins, Celtics, everything else, but Patriots. But if there was a soccer story, it was almost a chance. It was almost something weird must have happened. And so I think that it changed the media a little bit, that you could now talk more openly because they presumed that there was an audience interested in listening to that, which of course there was. But it still took a little bit of time after '94 for us to get to it being so crazy as it is today. And I really believe that had to do with media. I don't know if your perspective is the same, but once you could have a soccer-specific channel, or 2 or 3, or the English Premier League being sent to your TV on a weekly basis, that changed everything, because now you could cultivate more fans. But also, that's how you made money, was the contracts were television contracts. And so all those teams that were trying to bring fans, if you only got 10,000 people at a stadium, that's not enough to sustain the team. So you needed these bigger contracts. So when media joined in, or there was an outlet for media, then it changed the financial game. So instead of just relying on, Robert Kraft and the Hunts and, a few families who owned multiple teams in the early MLS years, then it became a better business proposition.
I think you're absolutely right, Rich, on the importance of media. Media is fundamental. It is, you think in sport history, and maybe Christine, you can chime in on this. Media always is transformative to sport, whether it's radio in the 1920s and 30s, which often people forget that a lot of people running sports teams initially were hesitant. Some of them were not at all wanting to have radio or television because they said, "Oh, it's going to affect our gate. Oh, we don't want people to listen to it because they won't come to the stadium." And we've seen that media is an amplifier historically, and it's transformative to sport in so many ways. And as you said, Rich, the change in media, before the 1990s. If you wanted to watch soccer in the United States, it was largely through public television, TV. You would find it on the international channels. You would get, the World Cup would get on TV, that sort of thing. But it wasn't prime time Fox, ABC, CBS, etc. Though small bit is, some of the main TV stations were involved at the beginnings of the North American Soccer League in the late 60s and early 70s, trying to get, they saw it as a TV proposition. Initially, then for various reasons in the way that the leagues were organized, that was an ultimate failure in some senses. There's an interesting history there. But once we get into the 1990s, the advent of satellite television, which changes everything in so many ways, we can broadcast much more easily. We can get, in the 1990s, you could watch the English Premier League here. Big time, and it became a huge deal. People became, there was a phenomenon across soccer bars across the United States, on the East Coast particularly because of the time zone difference, where people would go and have English Premier League breakfast. And they became fans of global soccer through media and television, just as you said, Rich. And so it's so transformative because all of a sudden it gets on everyone else's radar nationally. And so you have American mainstream media that all of a sudden says, this is a sport that interests people. So maybe we need to cover it in a different way.
Rich, maybe you can talk to this. I'm going to ask you to talk to one thing too, Kevin. You loaned us, for the purposes of the display today, a piece of quilt with dozens, hundreds of patches on it. What's the story there? It tells a story, I think. I see like multiple patches for Franklin and many other towns. What could you say about that?
Well, if you stay around me for very long, you'll hear me say soccer connects everything. I just believe soccer connects everything. I think maybe ducks also connect everything too, but soccer connects everything. And so tournament play through the 90s, as the youth soccer continued to grow, was a way to take your group to another city and play against other cities in youth sport. And so the tradition early on was that I would bring a pack of 50 patches and play against Christine's team, and all the players would exchange patches after the game, which is just a great way to share that we're in the same community playing this game. And so that patch tournament thing has sort of dwindled over the last 20 years, but tournaments are now big business. You know, they're not just fun events, but they're big business. So bigger clubs around Massachusetts are making $100,000 in a weekend because they're drawing teams from all over.
I'll have to look a little closer, but I think I see a Plainville patch.
Absolutely. No, that's you just. I think I have my next research project on soccer, the history of youth soccer and patches. It's a fascinating story, and we didn't talk about camps, but in the 1970s and 80s, we have a growth of soccer camps. It's like everyone takes it for granted that sports camps in the summer for kids. You know, this is something that is an outgrowth of the 1970s. We didn't have sports camps earlier in the 20th century, but soccer camps becomes a huge thing. Everybody does 1 week of soccer camp as a kid during the summer, and that's linked to this tournament culture of, you know, giving patches out and traveling, and what a wonderful kind of participatory culture. I'll pass back to you.
You can hang on to it, but I'm going to hand this back to you real quick. We have one of the things that we have hanging up is a clip that I think you pointed me to, Kevin, about a Worcester team getting ready to sail, because that's what people used to do to get to the other side, to England. Can you talk about that as an example of the depth and strength of soccer here at that time, and then maybe everybody kind of wrap up? But I don't want to kill the conversation, but I think it'd be really nice to hear how we speak the Chamber of Commerce version of how amazing we are, and we're the center of everything, and soccer began here, with a little more objectivity about how we actually fit in, a combination of those.
So a quick word to the newspaper clipping that's up there from Worcester County Soccer 11, which sails for England tomorrow. So this is in the late 1920s from, I get my dates wrong, but the first tour. There's a project between Worcester, Mass, or I'll get the pronunciation, Worcester, Mass. And Worcester, England, okay? And it actually is an outgrowth of World War I. I'll give a plug. One of my colleagues at De Montfort University has done some amazing research about this, so it's not my research. I'm crediting Dill Porter, who's a fantastic historian. He was interested in World War I and town twinning. So you're familiar with sister cities? Well, this is an outgrowth largely of the early 20th century after World War I, where we're trying to create connections between towns, have the same name, or eventually then towns that don't have the same name, but we want to create a connection. And here, this is simply because servicemen, American military from the area of Worcester, Massachusetts, during World War I, they went through England, okay, and some of them were stationed there for a short period of time, and there was connections made. And so later in the 1920s, the two town leaderships had managed to have a connection, and they said, well, we should have a tour. We should create friendship, brotherly amity, all of this through soccer. And so there were, I believe, 2 tours of the England team that came over to the United States. So I think the English came first. They were feted here. They played a lot of games. They had an incredible experience. And of course, thinking about fun things, this is 1920s Prohibition. So the English players talk about coming over here and not being able to drink alcohol, or not officially, right? And likewise, the Americans went back. So this kind of connection all through sport was designed essentially to bring people across. It was very much Anglo-centric, so it wasn't with other ethnic communities. It was mainly English immigrants, but a neat story there.
Well, I guess that other part of it was, what's the takeaway from all this? And was there a final coda to the Oneida Football Club? Like how that ended? Maybe we can get to that. But what do we tell our international visitors, ourselves, our kids, our grandkids about soccer here in New England? First, last, best, what?
Well, for me, as I said, soccer connects everyone, and we in the soccer community, I think, are very fortunate in that in this current particular time of strains on our community, where we're almost encouraged to be divided in some way, that I feel very fortunate that the soccer community is representative of everyone, and it's quite a bit of equality. There's the merit system is very clear. If you can play, it doesn't matter where you came from or what you look like or anything. It's just very, very welcoming in that department. And the fact that the World Cup is here right now is a nice backdrop on why we're doing this, of course. But I see that every day, every year, that children from everywhere come together and play. And that it's a wonderful game for that. Sport in general is wonderful, but soccer in particular, because it's played in every corner of the world and beloved, we're fortunate to have the game to sort of remind us that we can cooperate.
Like I said, I played soccer as a little kid, probably starting 6 years old maybe, and played it all the way until just about middle school, and I loved it. I stopped playing because other sports took priority, and I started losing interest. Started helping out with Norfolk Aggie. When I was a sophomore, I helped manage the girls' soccer team, so I got back into it. But working at Gillette, just being surrounded by the Revs, and now with the World Cup, my admiration of soccer and actually love of soccer starting to come back. And just being there last night with all the Scottish and Haitian fans coming in, and just the craziness and just how excited everybody there was, and just how nice and happy. It reminded me the same way. It unites everybody. It brings everybody together. And American football is starting to make its way around the world, and people are starting to recognize that. But to me, I think soccer started that and started bringing everybody together, and football is continuing it.
Maybe there's a reason that it's called the world's game. In that sense, it is a game that, even though it perhaps is owned or started by the English, or the Scots all the Scots who are here would say no, it's not. There's a great debate there, but Massachusetts and this area of the country can also claim to say, hey, we have our bit of origin story here. And it's particularly important when you're trying to illustrate sort of a national story about where sports come from, whether it's the shared history between American football and rugby football and soccer, all of these games that come out of the same origins, and how they later over time, over the course of the 20th century, can still become very unifying, as you said, Rich. So I think that's interesting. And maybe to end on the coda, Alan, as you were eyeing. So I put back up here just how we get to the end of the story of Boston and soccer history. So as you see that, there's a picture on the right side which shows Boston Common. It's not a picture, it's a drawing supposed to be from the 1860s of the Oneida Football Club. So, Alan, you asked about the Oneida. Where does it come from? The name Oneida. Yes, there's a Lake Oneida up in New York that is also associated to an Indian tribe, the Oneida tribe. The reason that the Oneida Football Club, Ball, Monument, etc., have the name Oneida is because the captain, the original captain, not founder of the team, but sort of organizer of the team and the club, was a man named Garrett Smith Miller, whose grandfather founded the city of Peterborough, New York, who was also a very sorry, not his great grandfather, his older ancestor. His grandfather was a great abolitionist and actually funded John Brown's raid, for those of you who know your American Civil War history. And Garrett Smith Miller came to Boston to study in Boston, and he was one of the non-Bostonians of the monument and the story of the Oneidas. And he was there. He came from this area. It was close to Oneida. So that's one identity. The other aspect is that the most important sport in 1850s and 60s Boston was not football or not even baseball. Collegiately, it was rowing, believe it or not. And the most important boat and the championship boat that rowed against Oxford and Cambridge at times in these transatlantic competitions was dubbed the Oneida. So the championship, the most important sort of association of a championship sporting team in the 1850s and 60s was the Oneidas. Now, so that's why you have this image where the club said, oh, we're going to call ourselves Oneidas. And that image, as you see there, kicking a round ball, doesn't look very much like American gridiron football, does it? Well, that image pops through American soccer history over the course of time, and that's what actually allows the National Soccer Hall of Fame to claim it and say, well, maybe this is a round ball, it's ours. And so there's various bits of pieces across the exhibit here that you'll be able to see. And that is essentially what brings us to the final, the monument here, which is, currently, as you see here, it started as American football, went to a soccer ball, got old, and then went back to an American football now. But in a sense, it's just a monument to American sporting history, very much the shared history of American sport, whether it is soccer or football. So maybe that'll be a closing word.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we could see if the audience has any questions. I have a gentleman in the second row. Fire away.
Do I need a microphone? I'll just speak loud. Just to continue on this last point, the transition of round ball, oval ball, with now the World Cup and the excitement surrounding it. Who controls that decision? Will we go back to the round ball, or could we just have both of them up there and stop complaining or debating about it?
I can speak just to that bit very quickly. Thank you very much for the question. The monument is technically under essentially the authority of the city's Friends of the Public Garden. It's shared responsibility. There's the Friends of the Public Garden, which is a citizens association that manages the public garden of Boston Common and the public garden. And then there's the City of Boston and their art commission, which is the art division for monuments and art and public art. So they sort of share the responsibility of what goes in monuments and memorials and the park itself. So they would be the people to ask, if you will. The shameless book plug is that the story is much more complex and messy. So if you're interested, there's a chapter in the book that talks all about that. But it could be just maybe why don't we have a shared monument? Why not? I don't know. For sharing sports history. But at the end of the day, it is essentially the city's decision and the local authorities' decision to be involved in that. So the American football, the Patriots have no claim to it. The U.S. Soccer Federation has nothing to do with it either. So it's a private citizens' monument in that sense.
Any other questions? All right, well, with that, I'd like to thank you all and bring this to a formal end, but if we want to keep chatting on or off camera, that would be lovely. It's been a great conversation, I hope. I've certainly learned a lot. No quizzes, please, but I'm not nearly as dumber as I was yesterday or a couple weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.